I said, can I see your ticket, please, sir?
The man to whom the instruction was issued gave a start and appeared to wake from a trance-like state. He rummaged in the pockets of his worn corduroy jacket and finally drew out a crumpled and aged card. The conductor, however, did not touch the ticket, but leant forward in order to scrutinize it. At no point did his hands leave his pockets of his stuff jacket. His face, shaded by a cap, appeared strangely paralytic and expressionless. It was devoid of healthy pallor, being of a bloodless yellow hue. The eyes were too far back in their sockets, as if sinking in the quicksand of bodily decay. Overall, it was too much like a dead face.
Have a pleasant trip, Mr. Gray.
The man who had been addressed as Mr. Gray examined the ticket, squinting at the print through his horn-rimmed eyeglasses. The name on the ticket read Robert Gray, but it meant nothing to him. No starting point or destination was indicated, although the name of the train company, Norach, was emblazoned at the top. I assumed then the man thought that I must be Robert Gray. He tried to keep down the wave of panic that threatened to wash over him. Since I cannot recall what I am doing here on this train, he reasoned, the only logical conclusion is that I am either an amnesiac or suffering from some form of dementia affecting my memory, perhaps with hallucinations thrown in for good measure. The cadaverous appearance of the train conductor was surely an example of mental turmoil externalized by a diseased imagination. Gray examined his hands. A few liver spots dappled the skin, and blue veins were prominent. He turned his head to the dusty window and saw his reflection, slightly hazy but still mirror-like in the darkness outside the car. His face was punchy and lined. Thinning white hair crowned his head. His neck had turkey folds. Gray calculated his age to be somewhere between 65 and 70. Perhaps it's senile dementia, he thought, since he appeared to be at the prime age range for its onset. His breath caught in his throat, and he fought back a second wave of panic. Across from him, on the far side of the dividing table and resting on the seat opposite, was a large black valise. Its leather surface was scuffed, particularly at the edges, and it looked to have seen a great deal of use. Perhaps there might be an answer in there. If it were his property, then the familiar possessions within might kickstart his memories, or at least give him a foothold in his own identity. The valise was atrociously heavy. Gray gasped with the effort as he hauled it onto the table, and then unbuckled the two binding straps that kept the lid down. Once he'd pulled the top open, the smell that wafted out alerted him to its contents before he'd even laid eyes on the interior. The valise was full of densely packed earth, and when Gray put his hand inside, turning over the moist and pungent soil, he discovered that it was infested with innumerable wriggling maggots. He closed the lid with a cry of disgust and brushed his hands clean of the black dirt that clung damply to them. There was no question now of keeping panic in check. Gray loped off along the aisle of the car in search of the conductor, or of the first person he encountered. A few rows further down he saw a man slouched in his seat, dressed in a rain mac and a wide-brimmed floppy hat that obscured his face. Gray hesitated before addressing the stranger, because he feared the face concealed in shadow. Would it be like that of the conductor? If it were, then he feared he would have reached a tipping point and might scream himself to death. But the stranger was conscious of Gray at his elbow. He looked up and revealed himself to be an ordinary living man, possessed of an ordinary face, albeit one marked by concern at Gray's agitation. "Are you all right?" The stranger said. "You look dreadful. Here, sit down." Gray hesitated for a moment, staring hard at the stranger's face, searching for any sign of abnormality. He could find none. It was the face of a harmless middle-aged man, slightly wrinkled around his blue eyes, clean-shaven, nondescript, bland in the extreme. It was the face of a million men who were passed on the sidewalk every day without leaving any impression in the memory. "Something's wrong," Gray burbled out. "I don't know how I got here. I don't know where I am. I don't even know who I am. You must help me." That conductor, for example. There's something—" "Calm down," the stranger interrupted. "You seem to me to be in shock. I know what it's like. Take it easy. Tell me about it." Gray lowered himself into the seat adjacent to the man, let out a deep breath, and tried to control himself. He ran his hand over his forehead, transferring a cold sheen of sweat to his palm. "My name is Black," the middle-aged man said. Gray replied, "Where's this train bound for?" Black grimaced. He'd kept his hands hidden within the outside pockets of his Mac and had not removed them since Gray had first spotted him. Now he made circular movements, as if twisting them around inside his coat. "Black, what is this train's destination?" Gray asked again. "Shush," Black whispered, "if the conductor hears you. The destination is not important. The journey is the thing." "What do you know about this train? Look around you," Gray persisted. Black's steady eyes looked over the enclosed expanse of the car in which the two men were seated. Sickly green paint flaked from the walls. Half of the lamps were broken. The spring suspension in the seats had given way long ago, and deep hollows indicated the presence of thousands of former passengers. The inside of the windows was coated with a layer of dust. In the overhead racks there were dozens of valises, all apparently without owners. "What I know," said Black, "is that if you insist on making a fuss like this, you're liable to be thrown off the train." "Thrown off the train just for asking a straightforward question?" Gray was now regarding Black with incredulity. Gray had anticipated some anchor in reality, a counterpoint to his own confused mental state, rather than an individual who seemed in an even worse condition than himself. "Of course, but I see you don't yet understand. Have you just woken up? Obviously you've not had the chance to see what's outside yet. Still too dark, I suppose," Black said. Gray momentarily turned to the window. It was impossible to discern what was outside. Even after he had managed to scrub away some of the grime from the pane with the cuff of his jacket, all he could see was his own reflection peering back at him, and an impenetrable blackness beyond. "I suppose, in a manner of speaking, I have just woken up," Gray said, shifting back into the seat opposite Black with a long drawn-out sigh. "But it feels as if I've gone insane." "It's said that if you die in your dreams, you die in the waking world. But what if you went mad in your dreams? What if you couldn't wake up and the dream went on and on and on? What about if you tell me what's really going on here?" Gray interjected, thumping his fist on the table between them. This was no dream, he was certain of that much. There was no blurring around the edges, no non-lineal procession of events, none of the recognized attributes that accompany dreaming. "Perhaps it's not your dream, perhaps it's mine. Perhaps you're just a made-up character, and I haven't filled you with memories and a past," Black said. "I need to find someone talking sense." "Excuse me," Gray said, getting to his feet and loping off along the aisle again, swaying slightly with the rocking motion of the car. Gray had gone through 16 deserted cars before he paused for breath. Some were almost in ruins, with seats torn out, and there were even signs of fires having been started in half a dozen. He had not encountered another person. He wondered whether all the passengers had deserted the train, alighting at an earlier station after having wreaked havoc in the cars, like rampaging Brit soccer hooligans. Only the elusive ticket inspector could provide an answer, but Gray feared that he might already be in a car even further forward in the train, at such a distance that exhaustion would intervene before he could be intercepted. Gray tried not to think about the prospect any more deeply, and trudged onwards, picking his way through several more cars choked with debris until he came to a luggage coach. He noticed at once the moist and pungent smell of earth, and was not surprised to find dozens of large valises piled up in the storage area. A couple of their poorly fastened lids had come loose, and the soil within had spilled out on the wooden floor, along with the writhing grubs who'd formerly been its inhabitants. The mass of valises was not properly secured, and they teetered with each sideways lurch of the train. He leaned down to get a closer look at one of the sickly yellow grubs wriggling around blindly. It was, like its companions, considerably larger than the ones he'd seen back in the valise he'd opened just after awakening. These specimens appeared more developed, and Gray noticed that each one was wriggling along the floor, towards the back of the coach, around and beyond the pile of valises. Gray followed in the wake of the grubs, taking care not to crush any underfoot, since he thought it would be loathsome to see one of them squashed. Behind the valises, he discovered more than a dozen black canvas sacks, and secured at the top end by rope. Each contained something that struggled to escape. They were piled up, one on top of another, in a mound. Gray thought that he detected the sound of a low groaning coming from a couple of the formless heaps. The grubs were not making for the occupied sacks, but for the empty ones even further back in the coach. Terrified, but unable to resist discovering some part of the solution to the riddle in which he was trapped, Gray pulled one of the sacks from the mound and untied the rope securing the opening. Gray couldn't make out the thing within clearly as it huddled up its stunted body to itself, as if avoiding the light. But he had the impression of a squashed and boneless parody of humankind. He did, however, see the creature's face before it had turned away. Its lidless eyes were wholly white. Drool oozed from its groaning, gummy mouth. The moaning from the other occupied sacks intensified, as if they were aware of Gray's presence, and were pleading either for his attention or to be left alone. He tied up the end of the sack he'd just opened, returning its occupant to its former state, and hauled the squirming object back onto the mound to rejoin its companions. He stumbled out of the car, his legs weak beneath him, shocked and terrified by what he'd seen. Were those half-formed beings the train's hidden cargo, on their way to be exterminated, the remains of scientific experiments that had gone horribly wrong? In the corridor there was half-light. Dawn had broken, providing feeble illumination across the landscape that could now be seen through the train windows. Gray pulled up the nearest window and leant outside. A chill blast of air buffeted his head, rumpling his white hair and making his eyes water. As far as he could see was a vast and dusty plateau, its monotony broken only by a myriad of tumbleweeds and lunar craters. The sky was a sheet of total blackness. It could not account for the dying dawn creeping across the landscape, trailing gaunt shadows in its wake. Gray tried to see the end or beginning of the train, but it appeared to be turning a huge curve on the railroad, and he was looking at the outside bend. He passed to the opposite side of the corridor and threw open a window there so he could see the length of the inside bend of the train. Straight ahead, across almost a mile, he spotted a white-haired man staring back at him. The train charted a circle, a gigantic wheel turning endlessly, a self-enclosed universe of railroad cars, without end or beginning.